Hi there, my name is Melanie Lynch and I'm the founder and CEO of Herstory. For Father's Day, Herstory hosted a powerful online event in honour of Herstory's godfathers and all the dads who have empowered their daughters throughout the centuries. Sandy Dunlop, co-founder of Bard Mythologies, was one of our speakers, but unfortunately, due to technical issues and a Darth Vader echo, he couldn't deliver his presentation. Sandy's back today on Zoom and fingers crossed the tech gremlins will stay away. To introduce Sandy, he co-founded Bard Mythologies in August 1995 with creative Bill Felton and his wife Ella O'Malley Dunlop, who is a direct descendant of Grainne the epic Irish pirate queen. Bard Mythologies are the great wisdom keepers of our time. They revive the bardic tradition, a wisdom of the people, which helps us to view life beneath the surface and make sense of the world around us through story, folklore, symbols, and archetypal characters. Personally, the Bard has had a formative influence on me and on Herstory. Sandy's team have introduced me to Jungian psychology and many lost mythic heroines who you can now find on herstory.ie and bardmythologies.com. I confess that I had only heard of 4 of the 22 Bard heroines before I was introduced to Bard Mythologies. In 2019, we illuminated the Bard's Art of Forgotten Mythic Women by Bill Felton onto Trinity College Dublin for the Herstory Light Festival. And I have attended 2 of Bard's summer schools on Clare Island, and I'm very much looking forward to this year's summer school online next month. And Sandy is going to tell us all about the theme and how you can all participate later. So Sandy, over to you. My first question is, why is myth important?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Melanie, for that introduction, and congratulations on the fantastic work you're doing with Herstory. And in some ways, the way I see it is that the goddess culture of old Ireland of the Tuatha Dé Danann were dispatched underground as a result of a loss in the battle with the Celts at the Battle of Teltu. And in a way, Melanie, you and your colleagues are reversing that bit of mythic history and bringing the goddess culture above ground. So you're in a way changing the story, Melanie. So congratulations on all the fantastic work you do.
Thank you,
Melanie, you asked me 3 questions and I will come to those. But you also then said, could I talk a little bit to the mythic origins of culture and specifically what is myth? And so I'll do that for a little bit just to put everything else in context. So in popular culture, the term myth means a lie or an untruth. And that's how we use the word in a colloquial sense. And in a way, what that's built on is a 18th and 19th century orientation of the anthropologist and various others, that these stories are the stories and legends of primitive people in cultures other than our own. So our myths we call our religion, whereas the myths of some other people we call, or the stories of other people we call a myth. And clearly those are untrue because our myths are true because of our religion. So in colloquial usage, why are we dealing with something that is a lie, that is an untruth? And fortunately, there's another meaning of the word myth, which is also true, which is that myth is deep cultural wisdom. And in that regard, prior to us having recourse to writing, the only way wisdom could be passed on is through an oral tradition. And given that the most effective way of remembering that tradition is stories, you have to encode the wisdom in story. And in an oral culture, such as Ireland was for 1,000 years longer than the rest of Western Europe, that is passed on by a highly valued professional class, the bards or the filly. And in Ireland, up to the 5th century, that was a class, a professional class that was as revered and had equal status to the king. And in part because the Romans never got to Ireland and writing didn't get to Ireland until the monks came, there was a very vibrant oral culture. So, and what that contained was the many stories of the culture. So I think the two meanings of the word myth actually fit together quite well, because there's something funny about myth is that once you start hearing the myths and immersing yourself in them, you think, well, actually, everyday culture is living a lot of lies, but it's the myths that have revealed the lies and the hypocrisies of everyday culture. So clearly the Bard is very much operating out of the second meaning of the word myth, that it is a rehabilitation in a way of a deep cultural wisdom. And I grew up in India, which also has a very rich mythic culture. My parents were Scottish with, if you went back a bit, an Irish ancestry as well on one part of the family. And so in a way, I was looking for a culture that I could immerse in, and I've always found that in the wonderful Irish myths. The thing that surprised me is how little regarded they seem to be, and how little attention is given to an extraordinary tradition that, frankly, I just find it's surprising, really. And secondly, these myths are quite extraordinary. So that's really what Ellen and I and Bill have been doing for the last 25 years. So in the 19th century, and I mentioned this, there was no doubt that the culture was interested in mythology. And two of the most notable names were German Max Muller, who was a comparative mythologist, and Andrew Lang in the English School of Anthropology. And Max Muller thought myth was a disease of mind, a kind of aberration, a metaphorical perversion in the development of language. And Andrew Lang thought it was a vestige of savagery that can be defined as a savage stage of thought. So you'd have to be a little bit suspicious that they didn't have another agenda that had to do with a kind of colonial attitude to the world, that there was in some ways an inherent superiority of Western culture, and that they looked at other cultures in a way to be critical of them, because in some ways that was a justification of a colonial agenda that had to do with civilization, as they called it, which is a bit ironic because a few years later we had the savagery of the Second World War, where Max Muller's culture and Andrew Lang's culture were engaged in what could only be described as an acting out of a collective savagery. As if you look at the war and the savagery in the trenches in Somme and those battles. So there was something quite ironic about this. But in a way, this established myth as lie, or myth as untruth. So things changed in the 20th century, and in a way, there's been a rehabilitation of myth. And the two people who arguably played a biggest role in that were two psychoanalysts, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Now, they have very different schools of psychoanalysis, and in some ways, this Freudian approach has been, I think, somewhat discredited, and the kind of things like the Oedipal myth as an explanation just don't make sense to many people. They certainly don't make sense to me, just looking at it experientially in relation to my relationship to my parents. But I think there's a very interesting idea that Freud, that is worth holding on to, which is the unconscious. And really what Freud is talking about is that myth is in a way a reflection of the structure and dynamics of the psyche, and I think that has some truth to it. And if dreams are the about the psychology of the individual, the myths are the dreams of the people, and I think that makes an awful lot more sense. And then Jung, who had more of a spiritual dimension, would have highlighted in his vast series of volumes the archetypes and the idea of the collective unconscious, that we share a common archetypal and mythic bond. And again, I think there's a lot of truth in that. In a way, myth has been rehabilitated, and my take on it is, in a way, more akin to the work of some French sociologists, who Gurney and Granet and Marcel Mauss, who basically say the best way to understand a culture is through the shared compendium of stories, myths, and films that are known by everyone in the culture. That was their argument, that it's a sort of brilliant way of understanding a culture. And they did a lot of works, understanding Chinese culture through their myths. And that's really the work I've been doing over the last 20 years in global branding, and where we apply the archetypes and the myths to global brands. But one thing we did over the last 4 years is collect these stories. We call it the culture's mythographics, which is the compendium of stories, myths, and films that everybody knows, in the way that everyone in Ireland knows the Patrick story, and some of the colonial history and various other things, Ireland's performance in football in the 1990s, etc. It's pretty much known to everyone. So if you want to understand a culture, one very good way of doing it is through not questionnaires, but mythographics. And we've collected the mythographics of 18 cultures around the world, the main populations of the world. And I think it gives you a very powerful way into, I call myself a cultural mythographer. What is that? No one, I made it up. So what it is looking at cultures through their myths. So I've decided I'm a cultural mythographer. I put it on my business card. I don't know anyone knows what it means, but I'm not even sure I do, but we'll put it down anyway. So here is the mythographics of a culture. It's a combination, particularly important, of the early childhood stories and the teenage stories. And they are very significant, because often a child has learnt the same story, or not learnt, but heard it over and over. Often what they want is for mummy to tell them the stories of the Three Pigs, or the Billy Goats, or Hansel and Gretel. And often they'll want to hear it over and over. And why? Because I think what these stories do is take a child on an emotional journey into their fears, and offer a way of them containing and holding the things that they're most frightened of. So in many ways, they are, and they never tire. They never tire of going on that same emotional journey. And if the mother or father is tired one night, they will correct them. They don't want any change in the story. And I think for a child, they're not listening to a story. They are in the story. They are Gretel. They are Hansel. And I think it's not very different when they go to school and again hear those stories. And often they are how they learnt to read and write. So what I think is these early stories are incredibly formative. And I think in terms of her story, it's potentially a very rich area to look at. Because, for example, if you are brought up on the Cinderella myth, and that is your formative story, or Snow White, what the girl learns is a sort of passive femininity, where you essentially are beautiful, and passive, and have very little agency. So whereas we found out in our global studies and our global mythographics that a culture like Denmark or Sweden, they tell the story of Pippi Longstocking, where this young, well, kind of mischievous urchin-like character is as strong as the circus strongman and able to lift a horse. And if you're and has a huge sense of agency, and but we'll be coming to that a little bit later on. But certainly, in terms of the Herstory, the gender-based structures are well established very early on through these early childhood and teenage stories. So where do I stand on myth? What I think is that myths are a articulation of those forces that act upon us, whether internal or external. And the beauty of myth it could be both. It could be one or it could be the other. And I think myths are particularly relevant for people who decide to live mythically. And I don't think everyone does. I think you can just get on with your life and raise your family and do your work. But I think the myths are about people who make other choices and want to step out of that, in a way, domestic domain, and in some ways better the world. And so I think, Melanie, there's no doubt you live mythically. And what you learn from the stories like the myths and legends is that once you step out of that safe home ground, that you will encounter forces that are significantly more powerful than you. Yeah. And that many of them are benevolent and on your side, but a lot more are not. And they're you will encounter those, and periodically they will get you, and they will get you down. Yeah. And at times you'll feel that you are going through a dark night, that you are falling apart. And in a way, every hero journey, the hero in a way dies. And I don't always mean literally, and I think the idea will be challenged very comprehensively, and you'll feel that you have fallen off the wall like Humpty Dumpty, and all you are a few eggshells and a bit of yolk, and you wonder why the hell you did it, and it's 4 in the morning and you're broke and you're wondering what you're at. But such is the journey of a hero or heroine. And I think the great myths of the world tell those stories. And they tell in mythic in visual and symbolic language what you can expect. You will be on a journey, an emotional roller coaster of tests and trials. There will be the dark nights, there will be times when you feel like your idea and your project is dying, but such is the nature of the hero or heroine that you pick yourself up and you get on with it and do a kind of death and resurrection. You read the Gospels and don't take it literally, but take it as a guide to everyday life, that you will be. Your ideas will be challenged comprehensively, killed off, but get up and read the Gospels, pick yourself up and get going again and put the bits back together.
Or rather than read the Gospel, actually read Bard Mythologies and the ancient mythic heroines, and they'll put fire in your belly, like more than Adam and Eve would any day. But you know, it's funny you say that, because looking back on the process, one of the biggest attacks I've had is actually around including myth in her story. And I've stood by that from day one. And I always keep it separate to history, but those stories for me are incredibly important because they are the collective wisdom of the people. They're sanctioned by the people. And we've lost that ancient feminine power that's evidently, it's part of what it means to be Irish. It's very much still dormant in the Irish psyche, coming back to life now with all the feminist movements. But we have an amazing educational psychologist, Dr. Emma Black, and we use a process called appreciative inquiry, whereby we teach young people how to rewrite the story, to reimagine the narrative. If they're not happy with how the story's going, you can rewrite the story, which is incredibly empowering. It gives them agency. It also opens up their perspectives. But that's a process that historians don't like because it's called speculative history, but actually it's really healthy psychology. So just two little battles that I fought, and one, because you have to hold the ethics of what you're trying to create too. So choose your battles, isn't that it, Sandy?
Absolutely, Melanie, and it won't be the last.
No.
So here is one of my favorite descriptions, is that from a wonderful book by Roberto Calasso, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. And what he says is, whenever their lives were set aflame through desire or suffering or even reflection, the Homeric heroes knew that a god was at work. So when I fall in love, madly head over heels in love, what the Greeks would say is Aphrodite's in me. Now, is that true? The goddess of love and beauty is in me. Well, no, she isn't. But is that useful? Yes, it is. So for the force of falling in love, this description of that using a narrative and an archetype, the archetype of the goddess of love and beauty, is useful. And as Calasso says, no psychology since has ever gone beyond this. In other words, the myths are the preeminent psychology at an individual and a collective level. That's inherent in what Calasso's saying. And all we have done is invent for those powers that act upon us longer, more numerous, more awkward names, which are less effective and less closely aligned to the pattern of our experience, whether that be pleasure or terror. So what he's saying is that the myth and the archetypes are a description of psychological and cultural forces that have the capability of overwhelming us. And one of the points about the myths is, if we do not know these, the myths will have us.
Yeah.
Rather than if you reflect on them, and that's what I see the Bard process is about, is understanding these powerful cultural and psychological forces so that there's some agency around it, that we have the myths rather than the myths have us. So I think that is a useful, is it truthful? No. Is it useful? Yes, it is a useful way of looking at these stories, that they are description of the psychological and cultural forces that act upon us. And a culture's myth is a description of the longings, the fears, the desires of a culture. And the myths are not true, but they are everywhere, was a comment made there the other day. So what they are is the communally sanctioned wisdom of the people, to be told by the people and to be interpreted by the people. So I see what we're doing in the Bard is just simply telling those stories. And one of the reasons that's important is summed up in a quote by Marshall McLuhan, where he says, "The one thing about which a fish knows nothing is water." And what he's referring to, I believe, is culture. If you've only lived in a Dublin suburb and spent your life within 5 miles of that, apart from the odd holiday when you go off probably to some other place that has similar Irish culture or whatever, you don't know the cultural water you're swimming around in. So hearing myth in an oral form gives you an opportunity to reflect on the oral culture that through oral storytelling on the cultural water that you're swimming around in. And I think that's very powerful. So what we do on the Bard, building on this, is basically tell and immerse people in the myths. That gives them a bit of distance from the culture so they can analyze and reflect on the myths they live by, because so certain of the myths may have certain archetypes that you do not want to live by, but at least you're looking at, for example, the Cuchulainn archetype, that battle spasm, is that a value? Are Maeve's values, but at least you've got a counterculture to look at, and then become your own myth teller. And I think that Herstory Light show that you shared the other day is a wonderful example of producing a form of myth telling that you're doing within the Herstory vision and project. So it's a method by which a culture and a community can systematically reflect and unite around a shared mythos and agenda that they all agree on it. So it's the collective stories of the people told by the people, so that they're commonly sanctioned. If they're told in a way that the interpretation of them is left to the people, then they will know what to do because they're conscious of these underlying mythic structures. So the myths never happened, but the myths are happening all the time, is a lovely quote from Phil on the Bard. So no, they did not happen. Aphrodite did not come, Athena did not come out of Zeus's head when Zeus's head was cut open with an axe. But it is a brilliant and useful description that helps you understand the Athena archetype. So there's a little few minutes there, Melanie, on the myths. So what you then did is ask me the question, Melanie.
How did you empower your daughter?
Right. Well, that's a good one because I don't have any, but I do have 5 granddaughters. So I'll tell you what I did with them. By the way, I grew up with an extremely powerful mother. I'm married to an extremely powerful woman. So as far as I'm concerned, the world is more a matriarchy than a patriarchy in terms of the strong women that I have around me and have always had in my life. But anyway, how did I empower? In some ways, they acted as if they had power, I think, the way they were mothered and fathered. But I'll tell you one thing that I did is I went into my granddaughters, Beth and Annabelle's Educate Together school, and I told them the story of Cessa, the wonderful first lady who arrived in Ireland in the mythic history. And this is the journey that she went on from Meroe in northern Sudan, through Egypt, up through the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, down to Judea and Hebrew mythology, to Greece and Italy. And to be honest, her journey is 10 times longer than that great epic, the Odyssey. The Odysseys are just a little trip around the Aegean, whereas this is a journey through the entire world, through the Alps, through Brittany, and then to Ireland. So, my God, in terms of a formidable lady, this is no Cinderella or Snow White. This is a lady who arrived in Ireland having experienced the mythologies of the world, and she arrived with the mothers of the world, which establishes a very feminine, mother-based beginning, in the beginning. And I think that I'm amazed that that story isn't much known by everyone in the country. We did a little global research study and found that hardly anyone in Ireland knows that story. I mean, there's obvious reasons. If you're running a patriarchal religion or culture, maybe that is the one story you do not want to be told. But we have been telling it for the last 10 years, and you've been playing a role in getting it out there. So I had the kids tell
schools workshop actually as well, and the feedback from the teachers were that was of all the mythic heroines, the teachers said that the children love Cessor the most.
Yeah.
And they got most empowered by her. Primary school children's fascinating feedback. We must get an animation of her commissioned or something, because she needs to be, she should be the first story you hear, because she's the origin story of Ireland, but she's too powerful for the patriarchy. So
anyway, here's my granddaughter Annabelle, and what I did is I split this class of well, it was 2 classes together, 50 of them, and I got them to tell. I'd done out a little thing of each one of the cultures, African, Egyptian, Assyrian, Greek, Hebrew, and they all had to do a little presentation, and I cooked a meal from each one of the cultures. So having told the story from their culture, they then brought up some food. And I must admit that Frankfurters from Germany was one of the most popular. But we also did Middle East food and all their cultures in between. So we ended up with a great big feast. I'm not sure whether they enjoyed the feast more than the cultural stuff. So so Annabelle and her class with their granddad experienced in Stony Batters Educate Together. So all these kids have heard this, not only heard the story, they've been through a sort of, they've been tellers of it, and they have eaten at the Cessor feast. So I've done it with Beth's class and Annabelle's class, and if they didn't like the granddad's storytelling, they did like his food. So that's what we did.
Did you cook all the food yourself?
What?
Did you cook all the food yourself?
I did, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, the point really is that in terms of these foundational mythographics, a culture does have agency in terms of the stories they tell their kids and the stories that are told. So we found in our global work that the Danes have this incredible story of Pippi Longstocking. Indonesia has a story of a woman with huge agency, Kartini.
Okay.
And of course, Disney has a wonderful collection of women with huge agency, like Frozen, Moana, Brave. Elsa and Anna in Frozen have a huge sense of agency. So things are changing in terms of the foundational mythographics. And my little contribution was taking the 10-year-olds in Stony Batter through the Cessor story in an experiential way. So one of the disappointments I've had recently is Game of Thrones.
Okay.
Because there was some wonderful female characters like Catelyn Stark and Sansa Stark. And you kind of had high hopes. I mean, there's some wonderful queenly behavior from Catelyn early on. If you know the series, and she, you know, there's some brilliant queenly behavior. There's one scene in the inn on the ford or something where her behavior is just very different from that little dwarf in that. Whereas who ends up? These two monsters, Daenerys Targaryen and Cersei. Jesus, you know, horrible portrayal of female power. It was absolutely shocking. Yeah.
Feminine.
Yeah. So, and I mean, Daenerys Targaryen with her dragons just annihilating the whole city. So that was a bit shocking, really. So anyway, that's why mythographics are so important in terms of the foundational myths. So moving on to the second, why don't you ask me the second question?
Sandy, how can men and women heal from the trauma of the patriarchy together?
Well, one of the things that I think is worth thinking about is the difference between gender and attributes.
Mm-hmm.
And we are factually either male or female, leaving aside the transgender issue, but we are male or female. Everyone born has a gender.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's more useful to think about it in terms of masculine attributes and feminine attributes. So each male potentially has a masculine attributes and feminine attributes, and vice versa. So rather than talking about it from a gender point of view, the discussion from an attributes point of view is a different one and potentially opens things up a little bit.
Yeah.
So let's take an archetype I know you've looked at very strongly in Herstory, which is Bridget. Well, here's the uncensored version. And here, when we were working in the States, we had to cover up her breasts. So here's Bridget and a triple goddess that builded with the wonderful shock of red hair. And if you look at Bridget, clearly from a gender point of view, she's a female. But if you look at her parentage, what you find is her father, the Dagda, actually has an awful lot of feminine qualities, a lot of feminine attributes. Whereas her mother, the Morrigan, has a lot of masculine attributes. She's a war goddess. So I think that makes her extremely interesting, that in a sense, from a parental point of view, there's an attribute reversal from what you would culturally find or expect in her parentage, which makes her particularly interesting as the healer, poet, and craftsperson that she is. So I just wanted to illustrate how useful it can be to look not just at the gender, but the attributes. And one way of getting to those is through her parentage, which in Bridget's case is what I have just said, almost cultural inversion. So what we do have, as you'd well know, is in Irish culture, there's a familiarity with the most familiar of the male archetypes is Finn and Cuchulainn. And one of the things that we have discovered is that these two archetypal warriors, albeit that Cuchulainn is a warrior within the tribe, defending the tribe, whereas Finn is more of a warrior outside the tribe, a kind of outlaw. But in both cases, it's one critique of both of them is they really haven't developed their feminine attributes particularly. And you see that in the Cuchulainn story in, for example, the Sons of Nacton, when Cuchulainn gets into a battle rage, it's only the women lifting their skirts and the women handling him that he's able to get out of this state of mind where he's unable to determine right and wrong. And Moriarty with Finn basically was of the view that he's a rather sad old man chasing Diarmid and Grania around the country, almost jealous that Diarmid has nicked his young lover. So potentially you do have two cycles of Irish myth, and right at the center of them are two very powerful male archetypes with a gender, but without a balance of the masculine and the feminine within them. So so that's just a way of answering your question, Melanie, is basically to say separate the gender from the attribute. And look more deeply at the character, because you then get a more nuanced construction that might be helpful. So question number 3, Melanie.
How can we turn the war of the sexes into a dance to equality?
Right. Well,
oh yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things, again, I mean, I'm looking at it from a mythic perspective, and what we have is characters like Fintan, and in a way, Fintan, who's Sessa's partner before she dies, Fintan, if we look at him from an attributes point of view, he lives for 5,500 years, which is obviously imaginative, but he shapeshifts. He becomes a salmon and a hawk and an eagle, and I think someone who's done that and who's experienced the ups and downs of life as he's done, because in a way, if Sessa brings the synchronic wisdom of having seen the cultures of the world, the first wisdom of the Irish, Fintan brings the second wisdom, which is a diachronic through time. He's seen it all. And I don't think you have much of an ego. You see the ups and the downs and the tragedies. And I think if you've got any kind of, out of balance, you just see so much. So I think in many ways that diachronic through time perspective in a way mellows and rounds an archetype, and I think Fintan has that quality. And in relation to his vision, it's laid out in Fintan and the Settling of the Manor of Tara. His style of leadership inherent in his fifth province model is a feminine style of leadership. He believes in distributed power. It's not about the strong man and the centralized linear hierarchical control of Greco-Roman thinking. It's more about pushing the power down, and he spells out this wonderful idea of the fifth province, which is Cuiga. Why Cuiga when there are only 4 provinces? Well, the reason is that Cuiga means 5, and we have this wonderful idea of the fifth province. And the point about it is the fifth province is not about a kind of patriarchal control and command and coordination. It's about, or consolidation rather, it's more about balance, which feels to me like a more feminine thing, and feasting, and then the whole idea and the whole ideology of kingship, which we'll come to. So when we look at the archetypes, we have, and particularly the archetype of the king, what we learn is some very interesting things around gender attributes. So for example, Cormac MacArt and Conora and Niall of the Nine Hostages. One of the things you learn when you listen to those king stories is that a king can only become a king when he mates with sovereignty. And sovereignty is the goddess, it's feminine. And, you know, what you've got there is a wonderful idea of kingship being a dance between masculine attributes and feminine attributes. And really the only successful king will have, in a way, reconciled those masculine and feminine attributes within them. So in a way, in the Irish ideology, you could argue that it is already a dance in the Irish mythic imagination. And one other story is of Niall of the Nine Hostages, where he and his foster brothers, in order to get water, have to kiss the hag. And what is the hag but the crone? And the other brothers, having none of it, they refuse to kiss the hag, whereas Niall does. And of course, the hag, which is a sort of otherized feminine, or the shadow in Jungian language, that in various times in history, we've demonized those old women and turned them into witches and slayed them and scapegoated them. whereas in the ancient Irish ideology, Niall, this great Irish king that set up a dynasty that lasted for 600 years, is the king because he kisses the hag, which is a dance between the masculine and the feminine. So essentially, Melanie, the question is in a way answered in that there is already a dance in native Irish kingship ideology between the masculine and feminine in their mythic imagination around their archetypal exemplary kings. So there is already a dance. It's inherent in the mating of the king with sovereignty, which is a mating with the goddess, and it's inherent in the Niall story of the kissing the hag. The only question and comment is that these myths of the king are not widely known. Okay. And if they were, you would already have a mythology that is to do with the dance. And in the process of doing that, you probably, if you combine the Cessa stories with these king tales and had people looking at Brave and Pippi Longstocking and Frozen, you would over a generation or two have evolved beyond some of these patriarchal, imbalanced, hierarchical models. So it seems to me that native Irish ideology paints a picture in the mythic imagination of a balance between masculine attributes and feminine attributes, which has been my suggestion that all along. And then look at the story of Macha and that wonderful story of the curse of Macha, where Macha comes into Croncu. You know, you've got an amazing war goddess who couldn't be anything other than a paragon of domestic values in the way that she looks after Croncu until he becomes a stupid boaster to the king, and she ends up in that ridiculous race, and then having died at the end of it, curses the Ulstermen so that they're incapacitated at the time of their greatest needs. And Maeve, well, maybe she's turned into a bit of a jealous bitch, but what a figure. And you know, people, well, Karina, our friend, long-time Bard attendee, she's been at every Bard summer school, and she set up this wonderful Herstory where she's exploring these often forgotten female archetypes and retelling the story from in Irish Myths Retold, which I'd strongly recommend listening to her material. So what we're doing this in July is we're having a Bard summer school, and in a way we're, I think, picking up where things start to go wrong, because the Celts arrive after the Battle of Taltu, and the goddess culture is banished underground to the She and other lonely places, where it's somewhat parodied by or ridiculously portrayed by leprechauns and little people, and how Hollywood did a job on them, which disgusts most Irish people, certainly ones living here. But the Celts arrive, and what happens is shortly afterwards we have Concaid Cahach, who is a sort of prehistorical figure just before Niall, and we're looking at how things start to fall apart. And in the Battle of Knocker, the Fenians fall apart. The two branches of the Fenians fall apart, and then shortly afterwards, this wonderful restorative healing image of the 5 provinces also starts to unravel, and we end up with a civil war between Concaid Cahach and Owen. And in a way, it's worth, I think, going through this in the Bard Summer School this year because of the time that's in it. It's 100 years after the Irish Civil War started. And we'll look at the seeds and how a civil war gets started. And in many ways, my view is that we might be considering that once the goddess culture and this ideological vision of the fifth province was dispatched underground, there was no unifying mythology. And the result is a brutal civil war, which of all the great tragedies, be they plagues or famines or wars, there can be no more painful primal experience than a civil war. So that's what we're exploring. And in the Bard Summer School, we've got a fantastic turnout. And there are a few places left. If any are interested, they can book on the Bard website, Bard Mythologies, or just send me an email, sandy@alexanderdunlop.ie. But in a way, it's about a culture that mythologically, I think, had a lot going for it, but lost the plot. And the result was civil war. And so I think it's a timely time to be doing this Civil War, myths of the Civil War, with it being 2020, 2021, 2022, because if you don't know the myths you live by, they have an uncanny habit of repeating themselves. I hope I've answered your 3 questions. If you look there, the bard has a mask on him. So he's a COVID. So this is a Zoom bard this year. The myths of the Civil War, the Battle of Nocha and the Battle of Moilena, and the demise, I would say, of the goddess culture, where there was a dance between the masculine attributes and the feminine attributes in both the male and the female archetypes.
Amazing.
So I hope that's helpful, Melanie.
Sandy, that was absolutely fascinating. You've just completely blown me away. I always had a hunch that the answer was in Irish mythology, to be honest, especially when we talk about rebalancing the masculine and feminine. So that was just, very profound. And I'd be aware of the concept of inner masculine and feminine from spiritual studies. In China, we have the yin yang, and then in India, the Ida Pingala. And the Trinity College every year, they host a Herstory salon, and they asked a psychologist to speak. And she got up and she taught them about the inner feminine and masculine attributes. And the students just lit up. They found it so expansive, this idea that I can be a guy, but I can have an inner feminine and masculine, and that I should strive to balance and harmonize and nurture both. It was just really interesting to see college students just, I suppose, experience a breakthrough live. So lots to think about how we can take this wisdom. And what I love, for Sandy, with what you're doing with the Bard, I'm so grateful, is because I can actually integrate the lessons, the learnings, the insights from the Bard, from the immersions and summer schools into the work of Herstory. So you've given me so much to think about. I'm really looking forward to collaborating in the future. It's amazing. Great.
Well, thank you, Melanie.
Stunning.
Yeah. I'm going to have to go, Melanie. I'm on a podcast on the myth of the plague. So I hope that's what you wanted. A pity we couldn't do it the other night. Yeah. So anyway, thank you very much, and keep up the good work, Melanie.
You too, likewise.
You're a star. Okay, cheers, Melanie.